Mr. Speaker, first of all, me like talk good morning to the people of Papua New Guinea. Unfortunately, Treasurer blame me no sit down by Harim Isla response blame all opposition. And we believe that it is a parliamentary convention that important bills presented by ministers should be present to take note of contributions coming from the opposite side of the House. Unfortunately, I'm not stopped. The Prime Minister stopped. The Minister of all Ministers stopped. And I think it's in his wise decision to allow another minister, senior minister, to sit in the place of the Treasurer to hear us out today. Mr. Speaker, Tete, after speech or talk blomi, we will hear from our end and from the government's end a lot of negative and positive debates will come from us as leaders of this nation to support or not to support the budget. But Mr. Speaker, first of all, at the onset, I'd like to speak well of the budget. Number one, I'd like to speak blessings of our Almighty God upon this budget. I'd like to speak goodness, blessings. I'd like to speak, like I said, well of this budget, that this budget will go well for the people of Papua New Guinea. The purpose of money plans is for the goodness of the nation's people. And so at the onset, on behalf of the opposition, I'd like to speak God's blessings upon this budget. Because without God leading us and being at the forefront of our plans, we will fail, Mr. Speaker. By me talk opening remarks below me. Mr. Speaker, allow me to highlight na talk below me, lo speech below the Treasurer on Tuesday. Basically, I will try my best to respond to most of the agendas or points or issues that the the Treasurer has come up with, and then allow us, the eminent members of the opposition also to contribute like the government in this budget speech today. Mr. Speaker, I welcome this opportunity to place on record on behalf of the opposition and the 9 million struggling silent Papua New Guineans our response to the 2020 budget that was tabled, 2023 budget that was tabled by the Honorable Treasurer, Honorable Lynn Stuckey, on Tuesday. As most honorable members would have realized, the numbers contained in the budget are very rubbery and makes it very dubious and uncertain. Mr. Speaker, the budget is the most important annual responsibility of any government as it lists all priority programs and activities that the government seeks to undertake over the course of 12 months of the next year. The effectiveness of the government's programs and its performance will of course depend on the outturn report of the end of the year. However, most importantly, the budget must be truthful and unambiguous to provide confidence in the economy and support of the private sector in this country. It is very important, Mr. Speaker, that the budget properly framed, and if it is implemented successfully, our people will benefit, Mr. Speaker. At this very important juncture, our young country, I remind the honorable members of the House that as leaders, our people are watching very closely at our actions. I also remind the honorable members of the House that whatever we do or say is being observed and will be long remembered by our people. It is therefore, Mr. Speaker, very important that we perform our duties as respective representatives, as their representatives, with care and consideration of the goals set by the founding fathers of our nation. One of our duties as parliamentarians is to scrutinize very carefully every bill, including the budget bill, that the executive arm of government wants to pass on the floor of this parliament. We on this side of the House take our responsibilities very seriously, Mr. Speaker. We will support the government in the greater interest of the nation when it matters, but at the same time, we will spare no effort in pointing out any flaws or unfairness in the government's legislative program and its implementation of the government's policies to make certain that the government treats all our communities evenly and fairly. Mr. Speaker, whilst I praise the Honourable Treasurer and also the Minister for Planning for ensuring that the bureaucrats compiled the 2023 National Budget Paper or Money Plan, I must also stress that the two ministers, as the entire Marape government, are fully accountable for the outcome of this budget. The government is also solely accountable for how the public servants apply the funds and implement the public programs and projects approved for funding under the national budget. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, I wish to inform the House of the displeasure expressed by the members of the Parliamentary Committee on Plans and Estimates, of which I am a committee member, and the way it was treated by the government's officials. I can testify that the committee was only provided incomplete budget information just a day before the budget was tabled on the floor of Parliament by the Treasurer. The committee received no information on the PIP component of the budget, 2023 budget. Also, officers of the Department of National Planning, who are responsible for the PIP budget, and the staff of the NSO, who are responsible for national accounts statistics, were not present to brief the committee members on the status of the national account statistics. For any meaningful consultation to occur, as it is required under Section 109 of the Constitution, the 209 of the Constitution, the absence of a fuller information and failure of advisers to appear before the committee is a mockery of the parliamentary committee, and such treatment of parliamentary committees, Mr. Speaker, is an affront not only to committee members but to the entire legislative government. Section 209 of the Constitution, the committee must be consulted prior to the finalization of the budget. In this case, the committee never received any meaningful information from the Department of Finance and the Department of Treasury in order to contribute meaningfully to the budget process, Mr. Speaker. In any case, they have certainly already finalized the budget before they presented themselves before the committee members.
Honorable Shadow Minister of the Treasury, by me stopping you lohilig na Honorable Treasurer I'm kamapinit, so rightfully now I must coxim siya. So me ask him, Honorable Minister, long works you. Honorable Shadow Minister of the Treasury, you can continue now.
Treasurer, good morning. In future, for any meaningful consultation to occur, I suggest the committee must be briefed at least 2 weeks before the budget is due to be presented on the floor of Parliament so as to allow the members of the committee to make meaningful contributions to the national budget, to make certain that the budget addresses the important needs of our diverse people and our country. Mr. Speaker, we on this side of the House have the responsibility to always remind the government that PNG, that Papua New Guinea, must always live within its means. That means the government should only commit to the country priority expenditures, and what it can really afford, instead of trying to be the imaginary richest black nation on planet Earth. We don't want Papua New Guinea to emulate the Caribbean country of Haiti, which was once the richest black nation when it declared independence from French some 200 years ago, but is now one of the poorest black nations in the world. Unfortunately, for a treasurer who does not miss a chance to endlessly remind the honorable members of the House that his budget is being a responsible budget, the budget fails to live up to even the simple claim. Mr. Speaker and honorable members, no doubt many of you have noticed how this treasurer has on numerous times tried to hoodwink Parliament with his continuous attribute of being a responsible treasurer. Mr. Speaker, when one takes a close look at the treasurer's budget speech delivered after several postponements, one cannot fail to realize that he has been deliberately and repeatedly misleading the House. For example, let me elaborate. In the last paragraph of the very first page of his speech, the treasurer states that PNG has achieved, yes, achieved in the past tense, for the first time ever, 3 years of consecutive economic growth in real GDP, exceeding 4%, namely his claim that the real GDP growth of 4.8% been recorded in 2021, 4.5% in 2022, and 4.6% in 2023. The only problem, Mr. Speaker, why we cannot believe the treasurer's claim is because he is stating numbers that are not in, but merely projections or estimates. Talk about counting the chickens before they hatch. The latest GDP figures in the official national account statistics published by NSO were only published last month and are only up to 2020, Mr. Speaker. The treasurer cannot for ignorance of the official statistics, because the same figures are featured in Table 1 of page 146 of Volume 1 of the Treasurer's 2023 budget papers. Do the honorable members realize that 2023 budget documents say planned expenditure of 39 million, whereas the treasurer says in his speech the expenditure is 24 billion. So how can Parliament trust the treasurer's words that the budget is a responsible budget, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, I don't intend to dwell on every false claim that the treasurer is making in the budget, as they are all plain to see by discerning readers, by any discerning readers. What is worse about the budget is that the government is counting on the naivety of the members of the government side to blindly pass this very dubious budget, which by the look of it is only good for 6 months, when one realizes that a number of important policies embedded in the supporting budget bills are only for 6 months duration. Mr. Speaker, the honorable members of the House will have realized that on paragraph 2 of page 14 of his speech, the treasurer makes it very clear that the government is unsure of his budget, and the government is likely to push some of the listed expenditure back into 2024, even after receiving parliamentary approval in the 2023 budget. The following that fellow members is just irresponsible for the government to get approval for expenditure in 1 year and only knowing that too well that it cannot afford such expenditures which are then deferred to the following year. In any case, the Treasurer is being deliberately dubious because he didn't even bother to identify the programs that are likely to be affected and is concealing this expenditure from the honorable members. Mr. Speaker, why is the government claiming record revenue collections this year when it cannot complete this year's education subsidies to our schools? Why are the soldiers going hungry with their mess halls around the country being closed? Why are the outstanding amounts to DSIP and PSIP yet to be fully paid? Why are the important and key offices, including that of the Department of Treasury, Finance, National Planning, being locked out during crucial budget preparation stage? Mr. Speaker, the honorable members of this House must also question the Treasurer's claim that the country is awash with foreign exchange and that it has 13 billion worth of foreign exchange, whereas just as everyone knows, in recent days and even in recent days, large multinational companies like Puma, Coca-Cola, Diesel have been complaining about being unable to repatriate their profits. Such misleading statements by the Treasurer, Mr. Speaker, do not bode well for the government, and that should be seeking to assure foreign investors that it is safe for them to invest in Papua New Guinea. Yumilukimlo newspaper finish now morning. Let me continue, especially new investors who are contemplating coming to invest in Papua New Guinea, as well as for those already here, are considering further consolidation of their business operations in the country. Suppose some blue play survey. Hastings Deering, Kokopo office is closed for such hardships the country is facing, and have moved back to Port Moresby and Lake. Why are our people being told by motor vehicle spare parts dealers that they cannot order spare parts for their vehicles because their banks tells them there is no foreign exchange? Just last week, honorable members, we recall Hamish Patel of CPL Group, the largest retail chain in the country, calling upon the Prime Minister and the government to make available foreign exchange because it's approaching Christmas and companies like CPL need to import goods in time for their customers' Christmas shopping and other requirements. Do the honorable members realize that the Bank of Papua New Guinea, PNG, Papua New Guinea's action in limiting the release of foreign exchange is encouraging exporters to keep the proceeds of their export sales overseas or in their foreign accounts, since PNG can no longer be trusted? Do the honorable members realize that following the government's futile attempt to introduce the additional company tax on BSP and diesel, the government now wants to penalize them by imposing a 45% tax rate on all commercial banks? And we all know that when you impose these taxes on banks, the end user, and that is our small people or people of Papua New Guinea, will be burdened. Do the honorable members also realize that it was the heavy borrowing by the government on the domestic banks that made them rich at the first place? Are the honorable members aware that the also over 14 billion in outstanding inscribed government stocks, and most of the debt are held by commercial banks or the superannuation funds, which are the major shareholders of the two large commercial banks, BSP and Kina Bank. Mr. Speaker, if the Treasurer is looking for lucrative businesses which make super profits to which to apply the additional company tax, I suggest to the Treasurer also to apply his super tax to the real estate businesses and the pokey businesses in the country. Do the honorable members realize that the government's tendency for borrowing from the domestic banks soak up all the spare liquidity in the banking system such that it increases the cost of borrowing and also crowds out our local SMEs, thus making it harder for them to borrow from commercial banks? Mr. Speaker, do the honorable members realize that the Treasurer has been hacking the 590 million of the so-called cost of living relief assistance package, and before the elections in March, yet he has continuously failed to bring the enabling legislation to the floor of Parliament. And we know that in the supplementary budget, he said the enabling legislations were not ready yet, and so the 611 million relief package was to be postponed to January. Was that all a real serious government policy to assist our ordinary Papua New Guineans, or just a plain election promise to show up numbers for elections? Do the honorable members realize that the 590 million so-called relief package is so inadequate that it translates to a mere one-off amount of 65 kina per person per year, or a very meaningless 18 toya per person per day when divided by 9 million people of Papua New Guinea? How is the government going to ensure that these amounts will trickle down to the ordinary villages? The government's so-called relief of housing assistance package is not helping families. Instead, it is pushing the escalating law and order issues in the country. Mr. Speaker, as we speak, prices of goods still remain high. The basic food requirements, oxen palm, sugar, rice, flour, even the fuel cost still remain high. Do the honorable members realize that the majority of our people are unlikely to ever see any benefit from this so-called government's intervention, and that the money could have been better utilized to ensure adequate supply of life-saving medicines to all our rural aid posts and health centers? Do the honorable members realize that instead of tackling problems head-on using the existing regulations and powers of the state, the government is belittling the role of Parliament by asking Parliament to pass new laws that are likely to be later repealed, just like the abolition and then reinstatement of the Chief Secretary Act. Similarly, the government is going the roundabout way when it is asking Parliament to pass the non-tax administration bill as part of the 2023 budget, so that it can impose its will upon the statutory bodies and the SOEs. Mr. Speaker, is the government now admitting that it does not know how to deal with its own subsidiaries? With its proposed non-tax revenue bill, isn't the government just broadcasting its own incompetence in dealing with these organizations? Mr. Speaker, Take the revenues that the National Fisheries Authority is collecting from licensing fees from the commercial fishing companies, for example. This revenue is originally derived from a tax, so why now treat it as a non-tax revenue, Mr. Speaker? By right, the state should receive all revenues from the licensing of companies licensed to harvest the nation's vast fisheries resource. Just as all the log export tax revenue collected by customs from the forest industry are directly deposited into the Consolidated Revenue Fund, all fisheries revenue must also be paid in the Consolidated Revenue Fund instead of being collected and kept by National Fisheries Authority. The proper way to do that is for the government to simply amend the Fisheries Act instead of listening to lazy public servants and coming up with a crazy non-tax revenue bill which the Supreme Court is likely to later rule to be unconstitutional, just as it did with the Public Monies Regulation Act in 2018.
We have a point of order, Honorable
Mr. Speaker,
Shadow
when we are
Minister.
presenting response, treasurer when he presents or the opposition presents, you cannot be entertaining
I
point of
understand,
orders.
Point of order.
there's a point of order, and I will make that ruling if I see the point of order is not in order. What's your point of order, Honorable Member for Vanimo Green?
Point of order, Mr. Speaker. The shadow treasurer cannot be preempting the Supreme Court decision on various legislation that are to be passed on the floor of Parliament. You cannot. You cannot preempt the Supreme Court decision or National Court decision on the floor of Parliament. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honorable Shadow Minister for Treasurer and point of order belong Honorable Member Blavanimo, is in order. You are preempting something that is not yet happening. So, and point of order is in order. You may continue your response.
I think precedence has been set. As far as the SOEs are concerned, their boards are appointed by the government, so the government surely has the powers to deal with them without the need for enacting the non-tax revenue bill. In any case, most of the SOEs are still dependent upon the state for their financing and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. Apart from the Kumul Petroleum Holdings, it is a might that all these SOEs are flushed with cash and can be treated as cash cows because sooner or later they will each face severe cash flow shortages if they are summarily forced to surrender their cash flows under the non-tax revenue bill to the Department of Finance. Mr. Speaker, in agriculture, for all of its emphasis on agriculture, with the creation of 4 new ministries as its key sector to spearhead sustainability in PNG, do the MPs realize that the government has allocated a paltry additional 79 million to the agriculture sector in 2023 budget. The whole country has high hopes that finally the agriculture sector, upon which over 90% of our people depend, would gain the recognition and attention it deserves, and expect that at least 1 billion would be allocated to the sector annually. Instead of perpetuating the colonial era endangered labor scheme, indirectly Australia's so-called seasonal labor scheme, the government could do more for the country by investing more in domestic agriculture. If the government is not careful, the endangered laborers working for Australia farms will unwittingly shift the competitive advantage from Papua New Guinea to Australia farms, which are still exporting oranges and vegetables to supermarkets in Papua New Guinea. So what is really wrong with a country when its economy, with its economy, with the country's economy, Mr. Honorable Treasurer. Our people demand to know, fellow honorable members, despite which side we sit in the House, it is our collective duty and responsibility in Parliament to keep the executive arm of government honest. So there we go, honorable members. I cannot tell you how you should vote, but you must exercise your conscience whether you want to continue supporting a government that says one thing and does the opposite. If you choose to remain silent and proceed to pass the budget and the related bills without debate, you will have failed in your duties as members of Parliament and the people who voted you into office. Mr. Speaker, the Treasurer has laid bare in this deceitful budget that the IMF will be in the country next year. That by itself is an admission that something is not right. The IMF is not like the World Bank or ADB, who fund specific development projects such as roads, agriculture, investment, or health programs, etc. The IMF only ever intervenes or gets involved when the fundamentals of the country's economy are in dire strait and need. They normally do so only after the country agrees to their very stringent austerity conditions. So before the Treasurer surrenders our sovereignty and our country to IMF, as members of Parliament, we have a duty to take action to correct the past mistakes of the governments before it is too late. Once the banks and the private sector lose confidence in our economy and our nation and our people, we are doomed. As a country, we cannot continue to pretend that all is well, Mr. Speaker. Every responsible member of the House is ultimately responsible for the mistakes of the government if by action or inaction we allow the budgets to pass without full and proper debates. Mr. Speaker, are the honorable members of the government aware that the Secretary for National Planning very recently, during the budget lockup just on Tuesday, that his department is still holding on to a total of 1.8 billion kina in unissued warrants from its development budget? Why can't the government use these public funds to complete the outstanding funding for our schools and our districts? But what has allowed this situation to happen? What is the government withholding money? Why is the government withholding money when our government services are screaming for funding? Is that what a responsible government does? Surely something doesn't smell right, Mr. Speaker. At least we are on this side of the House have pointed out some of the major deficiencies of the budget that is expected as of a responsible opposition. Do the members of the House realize that the entire national revenue of 19.6 billion expected to be raised by the government in 2023 budget, 13.8 billion is to cover the cost of running the government and leaving just 5.8 billion for debt servicing and PIP, etc. Do the members of the House realize that the government has been borrowing just to repay existing debts and will continue to do so forever without any end in sight according to the projections of the government's budget? Do the members realize that by increasing the tax on forestry by 20% from the already extremely high rate of 50% to 70% will instantly kill off the forest industry? Do the members of the House realize that the exports of logs only occur in coastal regions and logging activities provide the lifeline of economic activity for many coastal areas of the country because they do not have benefit sharing agreements as the other resource owners have for LNG? Do the MPs realize that the lies being perpetuated by the government that formal employment has been increasing when it has in fact declined by more than 20% since 2014, according to the official figures in the budget with forestry recording a minus 17% growth in 2021 because of the measures we have taken in this House. Honorable members, why is the government too shy to admit that it's dependent on log exports for as a very large resource of its revenue of 400 million annually? My question to the Treasurer is why disguise the log export tax in the budget just plainly as export tax instead of being specific just to refer to it as log export tax, since there is no other industry in Papua New Guinea that is subject to any export tax. The only possible explanation the government is behaving in this way is to probably to appease the activities of NGOs who have been tarnishing the logging industry in Papua New Guinea for decades, and the false accusation that the industry does not pay any tax at all when the industry in fact pays the highest level of taxes in Papua New Guinea. Whilst all other industries and business in Papua New Guinea are taxed on net profit basis, the logging industry, being taxed on a gross sale basis, is paying disproportionately paying more taxes than any other industry in the country. Comparatively, a publication by NRI in 2014 said that the forest industry proportionately pays more taxes amounting to 30% at that time, but soon will be increased to 70% of this gross revenue when compared to the mining and petroleum industries, which are paying an equivalent of only 12% of their gross sales values as taxes to the state. So you may look him. Comparison them talk 70%, not 12%. So where is the fairness in industries? Do the honorable members realize that over the years, the forest resource owners only receive a very paltry royalty, whereas the government receives the largest benefits from forest industry? That all forest resource owners in Papua New Guinea collectively share less than 100 million annually in royalties, as well as other benefits from community service obligations from their forest resource, whereas the state receives over 400 million annually in log export taxes. The government could still achieve its objectives for forest industry by diverting some of their tax revenues to increasing royalties to the forest resource owners and reducing the tax on the industry. Do the honorable members realize that the forest resource owners are all located in the coastal provinces and have no LNG or mining incomes? Are the ones who will pay the brunt of misguided tax on forestry when the industry is forced to shut down by the treasurer's exorbitant taxes in the budget? Do the honorable members realize that being a net saver of carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions is eligible to claim exemption on greenhouse gas levies? So why does the government plan to collect the additional 20% on 20% tax on logging to support a UNDP biodiversity fund when PNG is in fact eligible to collect money from the International Green Climate Fund, carbon money, based on its existing low saving levels of carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions? Do the honorable members realize that the additional 20% tax on log exports is contrary to the government's objective for encouraging more downstream processing in timber industry, because the major wood processing factories such as Turama in Gulf Province, Parakawa in Western Province, Medan Timbers in Medan, Vanimo Timbers in West Sepik, Oro Woods in Oro Province, Saban Enterprises in Milne Province have already closed down, and that the PNG Forest Products plywood factory in Bulolo may be the next to shut down its doors. Is this another application of another variation of the government's manifesto of short-term pain for long-term gain? Whatever it is, Mr. Speaker, it remains a fuzzy executive government's logic. Are the honorable members aware that the logging industry has already laid off more than 17,000 workers since 2019, when the government first raised the logging exports from to 50% of FOB prices? Next week, the forest industry says 3,000 workers will be laid off. So how will the government absorb all these unemployed workers and give them meaningful employment so they can look after their families? Is this your Christmas present to our already struggling families and citizens? Honorable members, the 2023 national budget does not show where the Prime Minister's much vaunted 200 million economy will emerge from. Billion will emerge from. The budget papers do not show it, and there is no government strategy to guide it. Mr. Speaker, the undisciplined tendency by the government to continuously borrow year after year to finance the budget is, to say the least, unsustainable. The government's past practice of bulldozing the budget through Parliament without debate reeked of a dictatorial tendency. The amendment of the Fiscal Responsibility Act as part of the budget process without input by the honorable members of the House is contemptuous of the elected representatives of the people and an affront to the budding democracy in this country. The FRA Act was enacted by Parliament in 2006 to rein in government expenditure by limiting government borrowings. The government must now adhere to the FRA and refrain from unnecessary borrowing simply because the country cannot afford any more borrowings. Our analysis of the 2022 budget indicates that the government is simply living beyond its means by raising the debt to GDP ratio from 34% of GDP to 60%. The government has weakened the solid foundation of PNG economy laid by our founding fathers following the independence. Although PNG has met its debt servicing to date without defaulting, this amazing feat cannot last forever if the government continues with its reckless public expenditure. We on this side of the House are committed to the country and its people and are willing to assist the government to pass the budget if it is responsible and will not bankrupt the nation. The priorities of the country, as we in the opposition see it to be, are as follows. Law and order, and thank you that you guys, the government has placed great emphasis on law and order. Education, health, and agriculture. Put him some money go inside law agriculture. One of you put him up. You got 4 ministers now, put him more money galore. Thank you. The government should cut back on programs that will not cost lives or deny education for our children. But we must ensure the maintenance of good order, evidenced by the rule of law and peace throughout the nation. Immediately, the government can achieve these objectives by cutting back on new infrastructure developments and a reduction in the administration cost under the current budget. One plus something as them people are discussing. Plenty departments, all got car, pull up lo car. But all work lo higher, na higher yet. Suppose people are checking records. The records will tell you that hire of vehicles mount up to millions and millions of kina. Excuse me. Any analysis of the 2023 budget indicates that as a country, the government can raise only 19.5 billion in revenues, including grants. But its expenditure stands at 39.1 billion. That is our total projected revenue amount to just 49.8% of the government's proposed expenditure level. When one considers that it will cost 13.9 billion to run the entire government system, we only have 5.6 billion available for other things like debt servicing, repairs and maintenance, to the existing public assets, new capital investments, and others. For the 2023 budget, the government plans to borrow another 4 billion to finance its expenditures is highly inadequate, and something is not right. This money plan, the budget, has major flaws that needs to be addressed and fixed immediately. Mr. Speaker, to conclude, what is required of this budget is prudent budget management and strict adherence to strict budget expenditure framework and strong sound policy. We know that a big slice of the budget is in the Prime Minister's office and that of the National Planning Minister's office, totaling just under 1 billion, and that needs close and proper scrutiny. Mr. Speaker, we also know that funds earmarked in budgets must be released on timely basis and not later in the year like the TFF program. Plenty students all go finish, now you may release in TFF go to school. All board members now, teachers now by go holiday, now time you may come back, TFF funds stop more. And PIP programs as announced by the Secretary for National Planning, that 1.8 billion in issued warrants that are to be moved within the next 10 days. How can we move so much money within a short period of time? Mr. Speaker, is this our last resort? Is this our last resort? Has the government run short of options and ideas to raise the much needed revenue because of some very important oversights in the past 3 years? Government has been talking about Pogera mines, Wafi Gopu, Pinyan as low-lying fruits. Now when can these low-lying fruits be picked and harvested so that employment in this country can begin to improve? Unemployment can begin to improve so that economy, the revenue can be strengthened. Mr. Speaker, before I conclude, I've just spoken about the low-lying fruits. And Mr. Speaker, I hope that the Prime Minister and his executive government can seriously consider Wafi Gopu, Pogera, and Pinyan, as we said, the low-lying fruits, and encourage our bureaucrats to fast-track these 3 projects for the benefit of our nation. And PMIZ as well, Mr. Speaker. Before I conclude, Mr. Speaker, allow me to tell you a parable. Liklik story. Lo place one pla lapun man, and planning plenty buai lo backside lo house. One ply am grow na short plat aso nem karib. O na ply o grow go on top no karib. Night now am sleep stop. One time o picking in blow him. Now o still man come. O no still him this la buai we am long ply. O still him this a short ply. O rush him taso now take off. Money no picking in blame o big ply man. Kirap now like fight. One time o man lo place. Them see not you picking in blame. Them talking more. Come talking me. What a problem? I'm talk Papa. All man come and stay. Oh no rush him boy stop on top. Or rush him this la short plan or take off. Or some fight him more man Lord fight one time more. And talk no can fight one time more man. In a run blood this la man him come to steal him boy. And run blood boy DY. I'm not like wait na go long plan I'm by Karim. Why na I'm short name Karim? We have to be very careful how we address the low-lying fruits. This bank fee, Mr. Speaker, that we have just introduced up to 45%. We are the second nation in the world to introduce that. Have we run short of options, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, I'm responsible, Mipla, Lodisla budget, now right at the onset, maybe in talk of them. With the guidance, with the leadership of our good Lord, as Papua New Guinea is a confessing Christian country, I speak well of the budget, and I look forward to seeing this budget be implemented for the well-being of the 9 million plus people of Papua New Guinea. God bless Papua New Guinea. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.